The room went dead silent. Every single MP stopped talking, stopped moving, stopped breathing. Because what Nigel Farage just pulled out on live television wasn't a rumour, it wasn't a theory, it wasn't something he heard from a source or read in a newspaper. It was paper, real official government paper, documents that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom had stood in Parliament and told the entire country did not exist. And in that single moment, everything changed. Keir Starmer had just finished making one of the most confident statements of his entire political career. His voice was steady, his posture was strong. He looked like a man who had nothing to hide and everything under control. He told Parliament, told the British public, told the world that his government had received no credible warnings, no red flags, no intelligence suggesting that the policies he was pushing through could cause serious damage to the British economy. It was a bold claim. It was a powerful claim. And for about 45 minutes, it looked like it might actually work. Then Farage walked to the camera. To understand just how devastating Farage's revelation was, you need to understand what Starmer actually said. Because the Prime Minister didn't make a vague statement that could be interpreted different ways. He didn't use careful political language designed to give him room to retreat later. He was direct, he was specific, he was absolute. Standing at the dispatch box during Prime Minister's questions, with the full House of Commons watching and the cameras rolling, Keir Starmer looked across the chamber and stated with complete certainty that his government had received no credible intelligence about the economic impact of the proposed immigration reforms. No warnings from economists, no red flags from civil servants, no analysis suggesting that the policies being pushed through Parliament could trigger the kind of economic consequences that critics had been predicting for months. He said it cleanly, he said it confidently, and the way he said it was deliberate. This wasn't an offhand comment or an unrehearsed answer to a question he didn't expect. This was a prepared statement, carefully worded, designed to do one specific thing: shut down the debate, silence the critics, project an image of a government that was firmly in control, fully informed and completely confident in the direction it was heading. For a moment, it worked. Some of his own MPs visibly relaxed. The opposition benches were momentarily thrown off balance. If the Prime Minister was willing to make that claim so directly and so publicly, surely there was nothing out there that it could contradict him. Surely he wouldn't say something so specific if there was any chance it could be proven wrong. That was the calculation. That was the gamble. And it was the worst political gamble Keir Starmer had ever made in his life, because while Starmer was delivering those carefully rehearsed lines to a packed House of Commons, Nigel Farage was sitting with a folder full of documents that made every single word the Prime Minister had just spoken sound not just wrong, but deliberately, consciously, calculatingly dishonest. Farage didn't rush, he didn't panic, he didn't go straight to the cameras in a frenzy of outrage and accusation. That's not how you do something like this. That's not how you make something stick. He waited, he let Starmer finish, he let the statement settle, he let the political world absorb what the Prime Minister had just said, and then at precisely the right moment, with maximum visibility and maximum impact, he sat down in front of a camera and began to talk. What followed was one of the most methodical and devastating political exposés that British television had seen in years. Farage didn't shout, he didn't wave his arms, he didn't rely on outrage or emotion to carry his argument. He simply held up documents one after another and let them speak. The first document was an internal government memo, not something leaked by a disgruntled employee or obtained through some back-channel source of questionable reliability. This was an official government communication obtained through entirely legal means, through freedom of information requests and parliamentary privilege. And what it contained was extraordinary. It was a detailed economic briefing prepared by senior Treasury officials, circulated at the highest levels of government, explicitly outlining the potential negative consequences of the immigration reforms that Starmer was pushing through. The language wasn't vague or hedging. It was direct. It was alarming. And it had been presented to cabinet members just days before the Prime Minister stood in Parliament and told the country that no such warnings existed. Let that sink in for a moment. Days before, not months ago, not in some previous administration, not in a report that had been buried so deeply that it was reasonable to claim nobody at the top had seen it. Days before Starmer made his statement, this briefing was sitting in front of the people who work closest to him, laying out in clear and professional language exactly the kind of economic intelligence he had just told Parliament did not exist. The second document was even more explosive. It was an email chain between senior civil servants and cabinet ministers. And what those emails showed was not just that the warnings existed, but that they were being actively discussed at the highest levels of government. Officials were going back and forth about the economic modelling. They were debating the projections. They were raising concerns and receiving responses. This was not information that had somehow slipped through the cracks or been accidentally overlooked. This was information that was firmly, undeniably on the radar of the people running the country. And still, Starmer had stood up in Parliament and said it didn't exist. The opposition MPs watching Farage's presentation in real time could barely contain themselves. Even some Labour backbenchers, the people who were supposed to be defending their leader, suddenly found themselves very busy with other things when journalists came looking for comment. Because there was no good comment to give, there was no way to look at what Farage was presenting and come up with a response that didn't make the Prime Minister look either dishonest or dangerously out of touch with his own government. Social media did not wait for the political class to figure out its response. Within minutes of Farage beginning his presentation, the clips were already spreading. Within 10 minutes, a hashtag demanding Starmer's resignation was trending not just in Britain, but worldwide. People who had never paid close attention to British politics were watching the clips, reading the headlines, and arriving at the same conclusion, that political insiders were desperately trying to avoid putting into words. The Prime Minister had lied, and someone had the documents to prove it. But what made this moment truly different from the usual political scandal, the kind that dominates the news for a day or two and then quietly fades away, was the nature of the evidence itself. Farage wasn't working with anonymous sources or second-hand accounts. He wasn't relying on the word of someone with an axe to grind or a reputation that could be questioned. He had official documents, government communications obtained through legitimate legal channels, material that Starmer's team could not dismiss as fake, could not challenge as fabricated, could not wave away with claims of misrepresentation or political spin. The authenticity was beyond question, which meant the only question left was the one that nobody in the government wanted to answer. Why did the Prime Minister say something so completely and provably untrue? And what he showed the world in the next few minutes didn't just contradict the Prime Minister, it didn't just raise questions or cast doubt. It obliterated the carefully built narrative that Starmer and his team had spent months constructing, document by document, email by email, memo by memo. The entire story Starmer had been telling the public collapsed in real time on live television while millions of people watched. By the time Farage finished, Westminster was in complete shock. Social media was on fire. Senior politicians were refusing to answer their phones. Government ministers were cancelling scheduled interviews. And somewhere in Downing Street, the people closest to the Prime Minister were staring at screens with a look that said only one thing. This is bad. This is very, very bad. This is that story. And by the time you reach the end, you will understand exactly why the people in power were so desperate to make sure you never heard it. There are two possible explanations for what Starmer did, and the brutal reality is that neither one of them is good. In fact, both of them are catastrophic for a Prime Minister who had built his entire political identity around being different from the politicians who came before him, around being honest, around being straight, around being the kind of leader who told people the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. The first explanation is that Starmer knew that he had read the briefings, absorbed the warnings, understood exactly what his senior officials and economic advisors were telling him about the consequences of his policies, and made a deliberate decision to stand in Parliament and pretend none of it existed, that he looked the entire country in the eye and lied. Not accidentally, not carelessly, but as a calculated political strategy designed to silence opposition and push his agenda through before the full picture became clear to the public. If that is what happened, then what Farage exposed isn't just a political scandal, it is a constitutional crisis. Because in the British system of government, the relationship between ministers and Parliament is built on one fundamental principle. Ministers must tell the truth to the House of Commons. It is not optional. It is not a guideline or a best practice or something that applies most of the time with a few reasonable exceptions. It is the bedrock of parliamentary democracy. When ministers stand at the dispatch box, MPs are supposed to be able to trust what they hear. The entire system of accountability, the entire mechanism by which elected representatives hold the government to account on behalf of the public, depends on that trust being real. If a Prime Minister can stand at the dispatch box and say whatever is politically convenient, regardless of what is actually true, then Parliament becomes nothing more than a stage, a performance designed to create the illusion of accountability while real decisions are made somewhere else entirely, away from scrutiny, away from challenge, away from the democratic process that is supposed to govern how this country is run. Senior constitutional experts were already saying exactly this as the scandal developed in real time. Some of them went further than even the opposition MPs were willing to go publicly. They used the word that everyone else was dancing around: contempt. Deliberately misleading Parliament is not just politically damaging, it is a fundamental breach of the constitutional order. It is the kind of offence that has ended prime ministerial careers throughout British political history, not because of partisan pressure or political point scoring, but because the system itself cannot function if ministers are allowed to say whatever they want regardless of the truth. The second explanation is in some ways even more alarming, that Starmer genuinely didn't know that the warnings existed, were circulated among his ministers and senior officials, were discussed in meetings and email chains at the highest levels of his government, and somehow never reached the Prime Minister himself, that he stood in Parliament and made a statement that was completely and demonstrably false. Not because he was lying, but because the people around him had failed so completely in their basic duty to keep him informed that he had no idea what was actually happening in his own government. If that is true, it raises questions that go beyond Starmer himself. It points to a system that has broken down at a fundamental level. A government machine so dysfunctional, so distorted by political considerations and message management, and the desperate desire to keep inconvenient truths away from the people at the top, that it could generate serious economic warnings at the official level, circulate them among senior figures, and yet somehow ensure they never made it to the Prime Minister before he made a public statement on the very subject those warnings addressed. That is not a minor administrative failure. That is a government in chaos. A government where the basic flow of information from officials to decision makers has been so thoroughly corrupted by political considerations that the person supposedly in charge is operating in a bubble, making major public statements about policy based on a version of reality that exists only inside that bubble, while the actual reality, documented, analysed and circulated among his own people, remains invisible to him. Pick your explanation. Choose the one that seems most plausible to you based on everything you know about how this government has operated, but understand that either way you arrive at the same destination. A Prime Minister who either lied to Parliament or was so disconnected from his own government that he didn't know the truth. A leader who was either dishonest or incompetent. A man who had told the country he would be different, who had built his political brand on integrity and straight talking, who now found himself at the centre of a scandal that struck at the very heart of everything he claimed to represent. Farage understood this perfectly, and he made sure his audience understood it too. He didn't present the two explanations as equally acceptable alternatives. He laid them out side by side and let the weight of them settle on everyone watching. Because the point wasn't to argue for one interpretation over the other. The point was to make clear that no matter which explanation was true, the conclusion was the same. Starmer had a problem that wasn't going away. A problem that no press release, no government spokesperson, no carefully worded statement of clarification was going to make disappear. The documents existed, the warnings existed, the evidence was real and official and obtained through entirely legitimate means, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom had stood in the most important democratic chamber in the country and told everyone they didn't. That was the reality Farage put on the table, and the government had no answer for it. What happened next showed just how completely Starmer's team had been caught off guard. Because when a scandal of this magnitude breaks, the first few hours are critical. The response in those early moments sets the tone for everything that follows. A strong, clear, credible response can contain the damage. A weak, confused, or contradictory response can turn a bad situation into a catastrophic one. Starmer's team chose that second path, and they chose it spectacularly. The initial response from government sources was to claim that the Prime Minister had been referring to a specific and narrow type of intelligence. That his statement in Parliament, which had sounded completely absolute and unqualified to everyone who heard it, was actually a technical reference to a particular category of analysis that the documents Farage had presented did not fall under. It was the kind of response that experienced political observers recognised immediately, the non-denial denial, the walk back that tries to reframe rather than refute. The attempt to create just enough ambiguity that the original statement could be argued to have been technically accurate, even if it was practically misleading. It might have worked with a different opponent and different evidence. But Farage had anticipated exactly this response. He had seen it coming from the moment he decided to go public with the documents, which is why before he said a single word on camera, he had done something that made the attempted walk back not just ineffective, but actively damaging. He had contacted Starmer's office directly. Before going public, before the cameras, before any of the documents were shown to anyone outside his own team, he had reached out and asked a simple, direct question. He wanted to know exactly what the Prime Minister meant by his statement. He wanted to understand if there was a specific or technical definition being used that might explain what he was about to reveal. He gave them the opportunity to correct the record before it became a public scandal. The response he received was unambiguous. Starmer's office confirmed that the Prime Minister's statement covered all forms of economic intelligence and analysis. There was no narrow definition. There was no technical interpretation. There was no specific category of information that the statement was limited to. It was a blanket claim. A comprehensive denial, no warnings of any kind had been received. So when Starmer's team tried to introduce the idea of a narrow technical meaning after Farage went public, they weren't just walking back the original statement, they were contradicting the clarification they had already provided. They were now lying about the lie, creating a second layer of deception on top of the first. And Farage had the record of their original clarification to prove it. The political damage this caused was difficult to overstate. Every attempt to contain the scandal made it worse. Every new statement from government sources raised more questions than it answered. Every spokesperson who appeared on camera to explain the Prime Minister's position ended up deepening the hole rather than filling it. Because the fundamental problem hadn't changed. The documents were real. The warnings were real. The Prime Minister had said they didn't exist. And now the government's attempts to explain that away were themselves falling apart in real time. Meanwhile, Farage kept going. Because he wasn't close to finished, he began presenting the wider pattern of behaviour that the documents revealed. Not just that the single incident of Starmer's parliamentary statement, but a sustained and deliberate strategy that had been operating for months. A strategy designed to control the flow of information about the immigration reforms, to ensure that the public debate happened on terms favourable to the government's preferred narrative, to prevent the full economic analysis from reaching the people who needed it before the policies were already locked in and irreversible. The evidence showed that regular briefings about economic concerns had been held behind closed doors, attended by senior officials and ministers, but deliberately kept out of the public record. That ministers had been given specific guidance on how to handle questions about economic analysis in public settings. Guidance designed not to inform, but to deflect. That media strategies had been developed specifically to minimise coverage of expert opinions that contradicted the government's position.